Okay, we'll kick this off. Welcome everyone to the inaugural inaugural talk in a series that is hosted by the Professional Development Committee of the Society for Causal Inference. We decided to sort of start these series of talks as just a way of folks getting to know, well, what do you do with a graduate degree in causal inference? Or what do you do with years worth of research experience in causal inference? Where does the arc of your career and trajectory of your career, where can it take you? And who better to start us off than Liz Stuart? So Liz is she's the Frank Hurley and Catherine Dorier Chair and Bloomberg Professor of American Health in the Department of Biostatistics at Johns Hopkins. She has joint appointments in the Department of Mental Health and the Department of Health Policy and Management. She was previously Executive Vice Dean for Academic Affairs at the school. Many of you are probably very familiar with Liz's research, but if you aren't, her core area of research is in causal inference, specifically in how do you compute causal effects in both experimental and non-experimental studies, and thinking about the validity of those effect estimates. She's published a ton of papers. She's received funding from a variety of sources like the NSF, the NIH, and she's received numerous forms of recognition for her work. So she's a fellow of the American Statistical Association, as well as the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In terms of awards, she's been awarded with the Mid-Career Award for Health Policy Statistics, the Gertrude Cox Award for Applied Statistics, Harvard's Murto Lefkopoulos Award for Excellence in Biostatistics, and the Society for Epidemiologic Research Marshall Joffe Epidemiology Methods Award. She currently serves on the National Academies of Sciences, and that's actually a good lead into what Liz is going to talk about today. It's really an honor to have Liz kick off this series of talks for us. If you have questions, we're going to save most questions to the end of the talk. But if you do have questions as they come up, please do post them in the Q&A, and one of the panelists will raise that question to Liz at the end of the talk. Thank you very much, and Liz, please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And it really is an honor to be the inaugural. I don't think I fully clued in that I was going to be the inaugural presenter when I was first invited. So really, it's an honor. And yeah, I'm going to be talking about this topic, which is a little bit, it's sort of like, we spend a lot of time in our causal inference world talking about the details of methods and designs and such. And this is really taking a big step back of like, how does the rest of the world think about kind of quote causality and causal inference? And I'll give a little bit more context for kind of where I'm coming from with that. But yeah, so hopefully it'll be interesting. It's going to be a bit of a definitely a non-technical talk, maybe a little bit different from some of our normal kind of causal inference kinds of talks, but I think great for this professional development group, and especially I think some good lessons of how we think about communicating what we do and translating what we do and the relevance of what we do. So hopefully of interest. Please do put in questions. And I know I haven't been able to scan through the whole participant list, but my guess is that many of you actually have other related experiences similar to what I'm going to be talking about. And so maybe we can even have a little bit of folks can put in sort of their own perspective on this, which would be great. And hopefully this also will be sort of a way to have broader conversations in our community about these sorts of aspects. Okay, so what are we talking about here? And yeah, and I will finish up by 12:45 Eastern to leave about 15 minutes for Q&A. Okay, so I want to give a little bit of context for what I'm talking about here. And actually, well, let me give a little bit additional background that's not totally on this slide. So the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, sometimes called NASEM, used to be like NAM, NAS, et cetera. They've kind of combined, is this sort of non-governmental academy in DC that was really set up originally to be advisors to the government. And I'm going to be talking about these consensus panels and ones especially related to causality and causal sorts of ideas. They also have some standing committees. So I actually serve on two right now. One is the Committee on National Statistics, which is about the role of federal statistical agencies and sort of the value of high quality federal statistics, currently a topic of a lot of discussion. And then also the Committee on Applied and Theoretical Statistics. And that is sort of about, yes, the role of statistics sort of nationally, et cetera. These consensus panels I'm going to be talking about are related to those, but are a little bit different, where these are sort of much more focused. So the panels I mentioned might be in some sense overseeing or sort of helping coordinate these panels. The consensus panels I'm talking about today are going to be our ones where there's sort of a more specific question that's been identified, and we'll talk through two examples in particular today, where usually the government, like a government agency, will say, you know what, we really need to learn more about X topic, and they will essentially hire the National Academies to put together a group of experts to write a quite long report on that question. And it has traditionally been, again, a very sort of like a National Academies report on a topic is often seen as a sort of definitive and comprehensive and very scientific, rigorous sort of contribution for that conversation. We could talk much more about this maybe offline. Doing all of this work as academics is not compensated. So we might get asked to serve on these panels, and I have found it incredibly rewarding. That's actually partly why I'm sort of starting to give this talk and talk about this. You know, it's essentially, it's important topics of relevance for the country, the world. Also, things you get to learn about a lot. So the first panel I did, which I'm not going to talk about today, but the first one was on truck driver safety. And I learned so much about eye tracking devices and truck driver regulations and stuff, but also was able to contribute sort of statistical thinking. Also just really smart, committed people. And so it's been a great way to sort of meet other scientists from around the country. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit more about that. The work itself, like these panels are, you know, they might exist for anywhere from, I'd say on the order of 1 to 2-ish years. Again, with the idea of putting out sort of a report at the end that is this sort of big treatise in a sense on the topic. And the point for today is that it is not uncommon for these reports to have causal questions kind of at their heart. So I'm going to be talking about two in particular today that I was involved in. And what my goal is, I'm going to give you sort of some context, some background, and then I have like a few lessons that sort of as a causal inference person, lessons that I think we should all be thinking about, or like lessons from these reports that are relevant for our particular areas. Okay, so the first, actually, let me start with the one on the bottom right, which is this was the first chronologically, which was looking at the long-term health effects of antimalarial drugs. And this one is there's a lot that are like this one, where there might be some question. In this case, basically, some veterans had expressed concern that antimalarials were leading to long-term psychiatric disorders. And in particular, what they were concerned about was there were some anecdotal reports of veterans like experiencing a psychotic event 20 years after their antimalarial exposure. And some of them were sort of advocating that they thought there might be this link between the antimalarial exposure and then much later psychiatric disorders. We'll get to this. That's a tough question to answer. But basically the VA had been getting enough kind of concern from veterans and veterans groups that they were like, okay, we'll do a study on this. And so our panel was put together to look at the long-term health effects of antimalarials on various outcomes, including psychotic symptoms, other neurological disorders. That, again, that's fairly typical. There's a lot of reports like that. Other examples are around like vaccines, long-term, like the effects of vaccines, or one that I think is either finishing soon or maybe just finished was on burn pits. You might have seen in the media, there's some attention to veteran or military exposure to burn pits overseas and that leading to health problems. So again, sort of things like that, where sort of a government agency is trying to figure out what is the evidence on some causal question. The top left was a little bit of a different one, where that one was more basically helping the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, think about their process for determining causality. And I'll say more about what I mean by that. But in this case, EPA has a whole process called the Integrated Science Assessment, ISAs, that help inform development of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So I'll say more about this, but in this case, our panel was tasked not with assessing evidence on a particular exposure outcome relationship, but this one was actually more about commenting on the process that they were using and how they even think about causality. So anyway, a little bit different, but again, some common themes. Okay, the first point I want to make is that and this is in some ways one of the things that makes these panels both, I think, effective and kind of fun, is the diversity of fields represented on them. So the sort of left one is the EPA study. So I co-chaired it with Ted Russell, who was much more of an expert in environmental exposure. So to be clear, I had done no work in environmental work before this panel. So Ted was sort of the content expert, and then I was sort of more of the causal person. And then you can see, you probably like there might even be people on this call whose names are on this slide. You can see we had like nice representation from causal statistical folks, Francesca, Yvonne, Kiros. And then there were also sort of some of these others maybe had more of content knowledge. The academies also really endeavor to have a variety of perspectives. So a couple of the people on this committee had some ties. Oh, Richard Smith is another statistician. Some of the people on the committee had some ties to industry and sort of wanting to reflect, like, again, different perspectives on air pollution regulations. The bottom right was the antimalarials panel, a little bit smaller. And again, here you can see just, you can't see actually, but it was a variety of different areas. So David Savitz was the chair. He's sort of a very well-known epidemiologist. Others had expertise in like brain, sort of neurodevelopment, study design, veterans, sort of that spread. So again, there's a lot of work put into putting these panels together to reflect a variety of fields, avoid or sort of transparent if there's any conflicts of interest, and a whole set. We can a little bit more peripheral to our conversation today, but there's a whole process there. Okay, hopefully I'm making sense so far. So let me just give again a little bit more context for these reports. So the EPA report, again, essentially has this process where they, actually I have a figure on the next slide, but essentially there's this process where they are tasked with assembling essentially a big literature review of the evidence on a particular air pollutant. So they might be looking at PM 2.5. And they basically are tasked with putting together a huge literature review on the links of PM 2.5 with, quote, health and welfare. So health is health. Welfare actually in this context means things like environmental impacts, so like maybe impacts on trees and animals and sort of beyond human health. That results of that literature review get summarized, I'll say more about this, in sort of a causality determination. And then that goes and informs a potential policy decision. So the ultimate thing that's happening is a policy decision of should we change the regulations of PM 2.5, but they kind of essentially do a big literature review to help lead to that. There's this thing called the preamble to this integrated science assessment, which might be worth reading. It's actually not very long, but it essentially articulates the approach to causality in this process and sort of how they think about what is causality, how do they assess causality. So our task was to assess that preamble and sort of suggest whether they need to update it, modify it, is it good, etc. Okay, again, this is a little bit more on that process of sort of that whole thing. I actually think I've covered much of this. The one additional point I'll say is that, again, so the way this has worked is that this sort of literature review and the development of these causality determinations is done by EPA staff. And that's what this preamble kind of tries to lay out a framework for. There then is this Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, which is a EPA appointed panel of experts, appointed by maybe the EPA administrator, maybe by the president. They review the ISA and then give policy advice, and then the EPA administrator decides on the final policy. I want to give a lot of credit to Corey Ziegler, who has done a lot of work, and in fact, he served on the CASAC, I assume until recently, maybe still, I don't know, but so he has been intimately involved in that. This is the sort of whole ISA process and sort of literature review. What I'm mostly going to be focused on is where that red arrow is pointing, which was the sort of development of scientific conclusions and causal determinations. But there was also a lot of relevance for causality in the evaluation, synthesis, and integration of evidence. And again, I'll say more about that. Again, just to say, like, so in the end, what happens is these ISAs are immense. So you can see on the left, this was the particulate matter ISA from 2019, 2,000 pages. And then the supplement was another 300 pages. So these are just immense documents and documentations of the research literature related to these topics. Okay, so how did our committee arise? This actually arose because of some controversy about the 2020 NAAQS process for that PM 2.5 determination. And essentially EPA wanted to, and you can see this quote from the CASAC chair at the time, who was a Trump appointee. Like, this was sort of the controversy sort of arose where basically the CASAC during the previous Trump administration sort of thought that the ISA was not sort of appropriate, and that they didn't think that the causal determinations made were scientific statements. So then EPA was like, okay, it seems like we disagree on kind of the premise of how we do this. So that's where they brought in the academies to set up this panel to, as sort of, again, like outside experts, to be able to sort of chime in and say, like, what's reasonable, what's not. The other context for this is that, especially in the environmental world, which some of you might work in more than I do, there's been a lot of methods development in the past 10-ish, 15 years. And so there was also sort of a desire of like, well, you know, should we update things now that kind of causal methods have been advancing? Okay, I'm going to skip this. This is like the long, there's a lot of work put into like the statement of task for these panels, and they are very specific. So I will highlight what's relevant. I'm not going to go through the details. So for our panel, what our job was essentially, again, to study this framework that as it existed. And then what we also did was look at sort of other frameworks that exist for similar sorts of things. So like Europe has a process for establishing these links. We also looked at things like the former National Academies vaccine study for how did that study think about causality. And so just sort of looking at like, are there other fields where there have been developments made that should be sort of brought over here? And then again, like the work itself involves like reading stuff, also some meetings, some of which are public and some of which are private, where we bring in experts from a variety of sectors to sort of learn about different things, including EPA staff to talk through kind of what they do. Okay, I will get to the lessons for us in a minute, but just a little bit more context for the antimalarials report. So again, I mentioned this already, there was sort of these case reports and anecdotal concern about these links. So again, the VA, Veterans Administration, asked the academies to convene this panel to look at this. One thing that was really interesting about this one was we were explicitly tasked with looking only for long-term effects. Sorry, I don't have an arm if I push it. Where there's like there are some studies that look at like, you know, is there a link between antimalarial exposure and outcomes within the next 30, 60 days? That was not our task. Our task was like antimalarial exposure and like at least 6 months down the line. So you can, as causal folks, you can probably already be thinking, oh, that's going to be harder to study. And so basically our task here was to do the literature review, basically, to find papers that were relevant for this, looking at a number of different antimalarial medications and then psychiatric and neurological outcomes, with a focus also on the military population. And so, this is tough. And in some ways, this one was an interesting panel because in my head, as a causal inference person who does non-experimental studies, I'm like, oh, someone could do this study. You could imagine doing a study where you have Veterans Administration data over 40 years and we see who got this antimalarial and who didn't, and we do some propensity scores or something, and then we look at outcomes 30 years down the line. Those studies don't exist. That's a little preview of what we found. And so really what this comes down to is like piecing together like maybe relevant information. And it was just really striking that like the sort of obvious studies just didn't actually exist. So I'll come back to that. And so again, this one was a little bit different and is more similar to things like the vaccines report from the academies, where our job was to come up with the statements saying, is there evidence of a causal link between antimalarial X and outcome Y for, I don't even remember, like maybe 8 antimalarials and 20 outcomes. So like a whole big cross of exposures and outcomes. Okay, so what are some lessons? Let me turn to that. So that's kind of the context. Hopefully you kind of understand the goals here. I'm going to talk through some lessons that I think are important for us as a field. So first, what is causality? We as a field, I think, debate that to some extent. But what was really interesting to me was, again, and let me just be clear, every member of these panels is super smart, like top scientists in their field, but just very different fields. And so, the biologists who do lab experiments just think about causality differently than a non-experimental epidemiologist kind of person who is doing large-scale epi studies. So like that, we could talk more about that, but like it was interesting. And in fact, for the EPA report, we spent a lot of time as a panel just talking about what do we mean by causality. And even some terms, for example, where the kind of statistician causal folks on the panel would be like, oh, potential outcomes, like terms that we think are very clear, were like not clear. So it was in part also a really good exercise in like explaining what we do. In the end, actually, Ivan Diaz wrote a really nice like causal inference sort of background text, which I thought was like very clear, but the rest of the panel was like, oh, this is like too complicated. And so it was put in an appendix. I do encourage you, I have links at the end to like scan it. But again, just like super interesting to think about how do we communicate what we do and what do we mean by causality. Part of that is that the preamble currently and still relies on like the Bradford Hill criteria, which is a little bit just sort of like, is there sort of causal links? And in general, I would say across the board, there's just sort of little distinction between a sort of vague definition of causality, like causality in quotes, as I put it, and then what we as causal folks might distinguish as sort of estimating causal effects. So again, it was just sometimes even just vague about like, what do we even mean by causality? And I think some of that was due to differences across fields. So we did sort of, you can see the quote at the bottom, again, tried to sort of bring in historical links in this IOM report, Institute of Medicine, which is what used to be part of the former version of the academies, did sort of have this language about like a claim about what the world would be like under different or changed circumstances. Like that was about as close as sort of we got to like a clarity of language. Okay, but we did get in the report itself, we did include some text around the definition of potential outcomes and this idea of like, but let me say too, because probably some people on this call might not be potential outcomes folks as much as I am. We, in part now, there was a whole chapter in the report on like ways of thinking about causality and sort of just trying to distinguish these different things. So it wasn't necessarily saying like, this is the way, but just helping people realize that there is sort of different ways of even defining what's meant here. The antimalarials report was a little bit also a little bit weird in a different way, which is that the statement of task, like our task, our mission, talked literally about long-term health effects. But then actually all of the conclusions we drew and even like the other aspects of the task were about associations. And like the tech, I was looking back at the text recently and like realizing like it's pretty squishy in the text. Like we were pretty weak in terms of like using actually causal language, probably, which was good because the data is not very strong. And I just want to be clear too. So in the end here, as a causal inference person who has developed methods and as a statistician type, we are often thinking about like, what is the study design I can use to get like a precise estimated effect? And we might be thinking about meta-analysis and like, I want an estimated causal effect and some standard error around that. That's not the goal of these studies. Like literally, these are the conclusions that are drawn. Like it's basically just categories. Like for the EPA, is there a causal relationship? Is it likely causal? Is it suggested of but not sufficient to infer a causal relationship? Is there inadequate information to infer a causal relationship, or is it not likely to be causal? Same for the antimalarials. It's like, is there sufficient evidence of this is the thing, like significant evidence, sufficient evidence of association, limited evidence, inadequate evidence, or no association? You can imagine that not likely to be causal and no association are almost never identified because it is very hard to reject that kind of scenario. The top one is also pretty unusual to have like clear causal relationships in these settings. But again, like it's like we have all these studies that feed in their information, but kind of the output is then literally like these like very broad conclusions. Okay, so sort of related to that, let's turn to question or myth number 2, which is that we can conduct a single, perfect study to answer this question. This one was particularly relevant for the antimalarials one, because again, in my head, I was like, oh, there's probably a bunch of like well-done epi studies out there where people have followed veterans over time and looked at outcomes. That is not the case. The EPA case is a little bit different because in the EPA case, as I mentioned, the ultimate decision is a policy decision about changing a regulatory standard. We can't intervene on that. We maybe could have some national data. We could maybe do some like interrupted time series, something, but the studies we have are like, again, they are like lenses into that, but they are not direct studies looking at the actual question of policy interest. So what do we have instead? And again, so the first bullet here kind of relates to that like in many of these cases, again, it's like we can't really do like a study that answers the question. There's like many populations, there's many exposures, there's just this inability to intervene sort of at the right level. So there's then tons of types of evidence. In both of these cases, there is like a lot of biological mechanistic knowledge. Like we know things about how antimalarials affect the body, and that's where some of the other experts on the panel, that was their area of expertise. We also might have some large kind of epi sorts of studies of like Francesca has done many studies, Francesca Dominici has done many studies on air pollution and mortality. In the antimalarials case, there were case reports. Like there were literally like veterans who were like, hi, here are my medical records. I took antimalarials and then here's what happened to me. And, I think that there was a link. And then there might be some randomized trials, but they're often very small scale, like especially for like the antimalarial, maybe for the original approval of a new medication. But again, they're often small scale, very controlled settings, etc. So a lot of the time, basically, fundamentally, what these panels are doing is what is called a weight of evidence approach, which again it's kind of squishy. And in my head, originally I was like, well, can't we do like a really well done meta-analysis? Like, couldn't we do that? But here, pieces of evidence are just so different. Like you can't do a meta-analysis where you're combining like a biological mechanistic model with 3 epi studies and 2 case reports. So the idea of a weight of evidence approach is basically that you get a bunch of experts in a room, you show them the evidence, and then they use their scientific judgment and their sort of judgment of study quality and relevance to, again, then come up with this sort of conclusion. And so in the end, like that was what the EPA was doing. And that's basically, in the end, we said, yeah, that's probably the best you can do here. There might be some tweaks around the edges, like these weight of evidence approaches are not always super replicable or transparent. And so sort of we did make some recommendations around like improving who is in the expert group, like making sure there are causal inference experts. But it was sort of more, again, like tweaking around the process rather than saying, no, you need to do something totally different. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. I know I'm kind of going quickly, but hopefully giving you a sense for things. So again, just a little bit more on that weight of evidence approach. Again, this is essentially the model that is used by almost all of these sorts of panels, decision-making bodies, including the WHO for their air quality guidelines, some other EPA things, the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And again, they are generally in this bucket where they then are just trying to come up with broad characterizations of whether there is evidence of some exposure being causally linked to some outcomes. So for the EPA thing, we said, yep, that's what you should do. And again, we had some suggestions around exactly maybe some like improvements to the process. And then for the antimalarials report, we basically did that ourselves. So we were doing this weight of evidence approach for these questions about the antimalarials. So in this case, luckily, this report had really good staff support from the National Academies. So the National Academies had staff members who basically did a huge literature review. They reviewed 12,000 abstracts based on keywords around antimalarials, the specific ones we were looking at, the outcomes we were looking at. They scanned that, they got to 3,000 full text articles, where we as a committee had sort of laid out like what we were looking for. And we were like, okay, these papers have to have studied malaria antimalarials as a prevention, because sometimes these medications are used once someone already has malaria. So we wanted to make sure it was focused on the prevention of malaria. There had to be some data in the paper on potential adverse events that happened, and adverse events that happened more than 28 days after the end of the medication regimen. So that was this, quote, long-term effect. They had to have a comparison group. So this was, like, we're like, well, to establish causality, we probably should have a comparison group. And it had to have data on adults. So we weren't restricted to veterans. We weren't restricted to time periods. We weren't restricted to, 6 years of follow-up or anything. So a fairly loose collection, I think. And with all of that, we found 21 studies. So again, going into this process, in my head, I was like, okay, we're going to have all of these studies, and then we're going to want to come up with some like way of thinking about study quality and like, rating them at least loosely on like, what are they, and thinking about like, what are the variables they adjust for and whatever. And in the end, it's like, oh no, we like are just going to take what we can get. And essentially none of them were designed for this particular research question. So there were 21 studies that were like maybe informative. And so in the end, we basically just like summarized each of those 21 and were able to dig into like the pros and cons and strengths and limitations of each of those 21 in a fairly detailed way because there were only 21 of them. So, and where we came out with that, so there were 21 studies that looked at 31 associations of the antimalarials we cared about and the outcomes we cared about. And of all of those, there was one that was determined to have sufficient evidence to support an association. And it was this particular medication called tafenoquine, and then this eye-related disorder, vortex keratopathy. Basically, all of the other 30 associations, we said, look, there's just not enough evidence that like we sort of did flag a few where we were like, you know what, there's like a very, very small piece of evidence and that maybe people should do follow-up studies, but there was basically not enough evidence to really say anything. And so the picture on the right is a screenshot from the report that just sort of talks, like this was like the conclusion. So this was for this one association. We said there's sufficient evidence, and you can see the language where we kind of put it in context of like, we mentioned chance, bias, confounding, and we sort of allude to like different scenarios under which you might show that. So if several small studies without known bias and confounding show an association, that could be sufficient evidence. Experimental data could also, but it's not a prerequisite, and sort of just really trying to be nuanced around like not having strict thresholds for evidence or lack of evidence, because it is nuanced and we kind of needed to be able to like look at a study and think about its contribution without having like arbitrary rules in a sense. Okay, question or myth number 3. To establish causality, don't we need to use a, quote, causal method? This is a bit of a, I have strong opinions on this one. So just as context, part of the reason this panel was set up was because there had been a growth in methods in the EPA environmental world that were using quote causal methods, and there's sort of various new papers that were being cited, like generalized propensity scores, this GPS regression calibration approach. There were these new methods getting used, and I think partly EPA was like, how should we think about those? Are they good? Are they bad? Are they causal? Are they non-causal? And so here's my plea, is that I think we have to be very, very careful that we don't let people say, I used a, quote, causal method, and therefore my results can be interpreted as causal. That is very different from saying, I used a causal method, and here are the assumptions required to interpret the result as causal, and are they satisfied or not? Like, and I feel this as a propensity score person in the sense that I see papers where people are like, I used propensity scores, therefore I can say that this is a causal link. But that's totally not true, because of course what really matters is, are you adjusting for the right set of confounders? So the problem is that it's much easier for reviewers to check a box that says, yep, check, they used propensity scores. It's much harder for reviewers to say, oh, okay, they used propensity scores. Is it plausible that those assumptions were met for a causal? Because the causal assumptions are untestable, are about things we don't directly observe. And that is just a lot harder for folks not enmeshed in this world to kind of think through. This sort of relates, if some of you are in the medical world, you hopefully saw Issa Dahabra led this new statement from JAMA around causal language, where basically they're opening the door in the JAMA network of journals of using causal language, using causal language outside a randomized trial, which had not been the case before. And I'm on the editorial board for JAMA Health Forum, and so I've been involved in some of these conversations, and it's tricky because now we basically are saying like, yes, some non-randomized designs might be able to be interpreted as causal. Likewise, some randomized designs might not if they have, a lot of attrition or things. And that's just going to be a lot harder for journal reviewers, editors, these weight of evidence folks to assess. So I think we as a field need to help provide tools and trainings to help people understand the assumptions of different methods, and when they can more sort of carefully use causal language. So again, sort of we need to be super careful to help fields avoid jargon and sort of just check boxes based on a method used. Okay, I know I have like 5 minutes left, so I'm going to try to be quick. Okay, so this is a whole other thing too, and which relates to that point, which is like, well, can't we easily know which papers or methods are better than others, right? And again, this is where, as a causal person, I went in thinking like, yeah, I can say like, what confounders did they measure? Was there attrition? Sort of threats to bias. But the problem, and there's been some push, let me actually go to this slide. There's been some push towards like very quantitative like rating scales. So this, like, for example, Robbins, risk of bias, something, 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 where it's like, okay, we have 20 elements of a study, and we give it like a 1, 2, or 3 for whether it has a strong threat of bias or not. And some folks doing evidence synthesis type work want to like give each study a rating. Like we're gonna just quantify each thing, and then we're gonna give this study a 4 and this study a 6, and then maybe we in the end we do a meta-analysis, but where we weight the higher quality studies higher. In theory, that I think makes some sense, but I think we have to be very, very careful that that doesn't get pushed too far. And I say this from lessons serving on a different thing, which was this blueprints clearinghouse of like assessing actually randomized trials. Like you can have 2 randomized studies with the same percent attrition, but where, because of the content and what you know about the intervention and the students, for example, in it, you're much more worried about the attrition in one of the studies than in the other, especially if it's differential between treatment and control groups. So it's really important to bring in substantive understanding about threats to bias. And I think it's really hard to do that in a sort of automated numeric rating scale way. So I think as a statistician, I've been sort of trying to think like, well, how do we give some structure to help people think about bias and assumptions, but without moving them too far to like unthinking checkboxes and sort of without that critical assessment. David Savitz, the epidemiologist I mentioned, has some nice writing on this where he sort of has thought about this in the epi world. Okay, and I'll just kind of highlight quickly here that in the antimalarials report, we tried to sort of put together some language that articulated this tension and sort of tried to like meet somewhere in the middle in that regard. Okay, I think I will. Okay, so let me just try to wrap up in the last couple minutes. So hopefully this gives you kind of a sense of like how kind of people more broadly think about causality, and I think some of the things that we as a community should be doing. I just wanted to quickly flag that I learned about this thing about 6 months ago called living evidence, which is kind of an interesting, but also maybe a little scary thing where there's these pushes towards sort of automated evidence synthesis where people would be doing sort of, I said these academies panels take like 2 years. The idea of living evidence is a more like real-time updating of information and evidence synthesis. What I am not sure is whether any folks with causal inference expertise are involved in that. And so I think we, again, need to be also sort of alert to what's happening there and how we can be contributing and making sure that the conclusions are reasonable. So some takeaways, these are like complex, big questions. And again, I became more and more convinced in many of them that like one single perfect study is not going to be definitive or answer like the question. Again, I think we need to help fields think about what is even meant by causality, and that might differ for different contexts and different studies. There's a lot of lack of nuanced thought about individual study quality, and there is huge value in engaging with substantive experts from a range of fields. One point, I'll also just give a little plug that at Hopkins, we actually teach this class called Causality. And what's cool about it, it's in the School of Public Health, and each department takes a week basically and talks about what causality means in their world. And I've done guest lectures for it and have like, so interacted with the students. And it's been so fun because some of them are coming from like labs, like they are like, studying like microbiology. And again, they just think about causality totally differently than we do. And I think it just can be incredibly useful to get out of our little bubbles, and maybe some folks on this call come from that world, which would be fantastic. But the more we can kind of spread and learn from and kind of communicate, the better. So then I think I'll just, this is, I think, basically my last slide. I think some other questions for us that I've alluded to a little is like, again, like how much can be automated? You know, I've heard rumors of some AI tools where people are trying to use AI to identify study quality. You know, how well can we do that in causal settings, again, with these untestable assumptions? I would argue that I think expert judgment is still going to be really important. So how do we kind of think about that? How can we ensure that our methods lead to transparent findings? And how do we help communicate the methods and results effectively? And I think this is even more important now, and with the current sort of discussions around evidence and data. I think being, you know, getting to sort of the basics of like, what is the data, what is the evidence, and again, being as transparent as possible. You know, just generally, how can we contribute? These sorts of academies panels are one way to do that, but hopefully there are other ways that we can provide our expertise. And then I'm also just my little new side interest that I haven't figured out how to actually do, but I am sort of curious about like, are there better approaches for this weight of evidence type strategy, or sort of a scientific foundation for it, to kind of, again, maybe like if we had two different panels, would they come to the same conclusion? I don't know. But so are there ways to kind of increase that, some of those processes? Okay, that's it. So these are, you probably can't even, I don't have a QR code or anything, so you won't even be able to find them. But hopefully you could find the reports easily. I'm happy to send them by email or whatever. And anyway, so I will stop there and we can turn to the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Liz. I will look through the questions. So just as a reminder, if you do have more questions, please drop your questions in the Q&A section. All right, looking through these, we'll start with a comment first. So Lohua Yuan says, completely agree with this warning and call to action. That's with respect to the part of your talk where you were saying just because you used a propensity score method that doesn't make your the final number you compute causal. Okay, question. Harsh Parekh asks, he has multiple questions. I'm going to focus on one of them. How are committees or panel members selected? Who selects the panel? And for well-meaning members of the community, I second this, is what are some ways to actually get involved with the academies?
Excellent question. And by the way, Harsh is my postdoc, so he and I can chat more later too. Yeah, great question. So there's a couple ways. One is usually I mentioned the Committee on National Statistics and the Committee on Applied and Theoretical Statistics. We often get asked for ideas. So part of it is just that sort of network, and just kind of partly people are asked to be on those because we might know a lot of people. And so it's sort of just like spreading that way. Another is most of the time for these panels, maybe all the time actually, there's like a request for experts, request for nominations. And so like in my department chair role, if those come across my desk, I might share it with my department to say, hey, is anyone interested in this? I think I would say I wouldn't, honestly, just in this professional development sense, I wouldn't jump to do it as an assistant professor. It's a lot of work and it's unpaid, and it is really a true service activity. It is a good thing to do. I would be sort of like, I think I did my first one, maybe associate professor kind of stage. So I think, you know, kind of you can wait a little. And the other advice I would give is, oh, sorry, sometimes people get asked when they're a little bit more junior if it's a topic like super well aligned with what they're doing. And like then you might be like, yeah, it's worth doing, because you like I have friends who do a lot of work on opioids, and like there was an opioid project, and like it was like so core to what they did that they're like, yes, of course I want to be part of that. As statisticians, we sometimes get asked to be on sort of random ones, like the truck driver one, and so those you might be a little bit more picky or choosy. So, and then the other advice I have is if you're asked, try to find out what staff support there is at the academies, because the workload can vary tremendously based on what they expect the panel to do versus what the staff are going to do.
Cool. Christopher Phillips asks, were the biostatisticians and statisticians on the consensus panels the folks who ultimately assessed the studies and the evidence to generate some consensus? Because it seems like subject matter experts would be too tied to particular approaches. And what was your role as a causal inference expert? And
This is really where it's a true panel weight of evidence across everyone, where like even like as a statistician, I don't know what the important confounders are to adjust for. And so that's where having the substantive experts is crucial for the conversation. Or I might not understand like why this outcome is linked to this thing, but like the biology, like the biologist might be like, oh yeah, it's because of this. Or I didn't get into this, but there were some really interesting conversations about the health and welfare and sort of differences in those contexts. So really it's meant to be like each person contributing their expertise in a way that makes the whole process better. What you're alluding to, in my experience on these panels, people are not like you alluded to something like they're tied to a particular approach. This is partly what the Academies does in setting up these panels is they're really looking for people who are open-minded, have not had sort of strong ideological kind of opinions on something. Like they're looking for people with expertise, but who are not going to be like, well, I just think that air pollution does not cause any problems. Like, and they even actually ask, like, have you written op-eds? Like, have you written things that might be sort of seen as interfering with your ability to be unbiased? And they are looking honestly for people who are willing to change their mind. And so part of it is sort of their job at the Academies is to find that good mix of people who might come from different perspectives, but also be able to engage in these sorts of rigorous and sort of scientific conversations.
sweet. Okay, so I'm going to compress a few questions together because I think they're all about a similar existential question. People are saying, I have a hard time or struggle to explain exactly what I consider to be causal inference, causal in quotes, when speaking with other statisticians or scientists who aren't really in the causal inference world. Do you have experience with coming up with a concise yet understandable way of explaining causal inference? How do you tell people what you study, and how do you synthesize information of how other disciplines define causality?
Yeah, great questions. I don't know that I don't have these would be like maybe for the Causal Inference conference, we can have some broader discussions on these things. The way I often approach it, and when I teach Causal Inference is, and again, I was trained by John Rubin, I am a potential outcomes kind of person. So I tend to talk about it in terms of these like potential worlds of kind of a like, I want to compare two states of the world, one with a program, one without the program, or, I want to compare what would happen to a group of people if they get the program versus they don't get the program. And sort of that idea of like comparing potential outcomes for the same group of people under two different conditions. So that's sort of how I think about defining what I'm usually, and again, I'm usually thinking about this sort of estimating causal effects context. The other piece of that then is in like studies and stuff. And one thing we've done in some papers that we did get into the Annals of Internal Medicine with a non-experimental study design, or like sort of strong difference in differences study, was like use language like this result can be interpreted as causal if we assume blah blah blah, and then we think that that is a reasonable assumption in this case. So kind of tying the causal statement with the assumption, the sort of key assumption required. And then, so in some sense being transparent, like you might disagree with this assumption, and so you might not interpret it as causal, but that to interpret it as causal, we assume this. So those are some of the strategies I've used.
Cool. So kind of as a follow-up, there's another question that asks, how do you separate the weight of evidence determinations from the implications? Because causal inference experts are often quite critical of the strength of causal conclusions that somebody else might think are actually quite sufficient for action. So, this can kind of bleed into the evidence assessment. It disadvantages people who know the most about methods and are, I guess, more critical of it as a result. So yeah, how do you weigh that sort of, I guess one more way of putting it is you could end up with decision paralysis, where if you're too critical of everything, you do nothing.
Yes. Yeah, and in some ways this might be why in some ways the like four categories for causality are like a little easier in that sense. I struggled with this a lot in the EPA study because it did feel like this sort of disconnect where our our conclusions were, or what we were guiding was like a process for determining does pollutant X have a link, a causal link to outcome Y. The policy decision is like, should we change the PM 2.5 threshold, regulatory threshold? There's not a clear one-to-one relationship there. And so and that's actually where the statement of task comes in, where like in some ways for this report, I had to just set that aside and be like, our job is to do this. There's a whole other process getting from this determination to the policy decision. And I just kind of had to hope that there were reasonable, smart people thinking about that, and using up, maybe even using other information. But yeah, there was a sort of disconnect in that sense, which we kind of punted on because again, this is where the scope of work is really, really tight for these panels. But yeah, it's a good question that was definitely in the back of my head during that.
Cool. All right. We've got another question that says, have you been an expert witness in a court to apply causal inference, and how did it go?
Love that question. No, I have not. I did my first expert witnessy thing recently, but it was on missing data, not causal inference. And
I hear they're related.
I would love a community conversation about this. Partly, I got a little obsessed with it because of this. I recommend you. Sorry, this is aside. Radiolab had this amazing podcast episode on the Daubert decision and the Daubert rule, and it was fundamentally about causality and essentially like driven by like was like this kid's disease caused by some medication or some exposure, which is like it makes me nervous from a causal perspective, like individual causality, like that's incredibly hard. But then I think we as a field really should be sort of grappling with like, well, how can we contribute to those conversations? So short answer is no, I haven't, but it's been kind of something in the back of my head that I would love more conversations on.
What advice would you have for someone who's on a review panel or has been on panels, but the statisticians' review seem to be more of a formality and not really taken into consideration seriously?
Oh yeah, that's a great and sometimes for example journals will do like the main review first and then the stat review, which I don't think is a helpful process. I think they're trying to find some allies to sort of bring in the statistical voice earlier. Pointing that out, yeah, and maybe suggesting changes to the process to kind of ensure that. What also has helped on all of these is having more than one statistician. This is true on like NIH grant review panels too. I've often found it helpful to at least have two in the room who can then kind of work together to help facilitate some of this.
All right, and then because this has come up a few times, thoughts on large language models for speeding up the meta reviews?
Yeah, and that's the thing that like I'm really interested in, and I haven't really dug into. My quick take, not informed quick take, is that my hunch is that they are going to be really useful for some pieces, like maybe just like finding the papers, like screening abstracts or something. I am more nervous about their use for like actually assessing study quality in terms of like a propensity score analysis. I've done some playing around with just basic models, and they essentially just give back the limitation section of the paper, which like, I think is not really what we want. Like we want more nuanced sort of discussion. So I think it's a really interesting question, and would love to see some thoughtful work on that.
Well, we might be able to do two more, or one quick one, maybe. Should we be asking policy researchers to focus on effect sizes and standard errors and move away from whether something is significant or not?
Oh, yeah, I mean, sure. Or at least, yeah, I'm a big fan of confidence intervals over just p-values or something. So I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Cool. And would you be able to share the syllabus for the Hopkins causality course?
Um, Probably. I'm puzzling only because I'm not sure there really is a syllabus per se. Like it's basically like a seminar where someone just comes each week and talks. Um, so I could ask Gundala Bosch is the main instructor for that. She might have readings or something, but it's a pretty low, um, whatever, pretty casual course.
All right, we've got one more minute. Is there a difference between conducting meta-analysis or incorporating evidence from a study that explicitly computes causal effect estimates versus conducts just causal discovery?
I would hope so, because in my mind, those are very different goals of a study. And so I think a good evidence synthesis using those would sort of reflect that and sort of take what each of them is doing at what it's doing and not sort of trying to equate them to each other.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much,
Congrats.
Liz, for taking the time to chat with us. For folks who are interested in more talks, you can find them on the Society for Causal Inference website or the OCIS website, the Online Causal Inference Seminar. So this is sort of joint work between those two groups. So I think our future talks will be at 11:30 rather than noon. So please, if you're interested in more talks, check out those two websites. Thank you again, Liz, for taking the time to chat with us.
This was great. Thank you all.